Hey guys, tonight we go back to the heart of the ancient world, back to marble temples and shadowed forums where torches flicker and whispers echo through the Senate walls. But this isn't just any Roman tale. Tonight we step into the final night of a man who shaped empires, a man loved by thousands and feared by the same Julius Caesar. But what did he see in his final dream? What whispers visited his sleep before the Ides of March arrived? Was it fate, a warning, or simply the heavy sigh of a weary soul? In this quiet retelling, we don't follow the battles. We walk beside the man, in silence, in shadows, through the corridors of his final thoughts, before history changed forever. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Are you in New York? Or maybe somewhere in Texas, California, or somewhere overseas? Wherever you are, dim the light, leave the world, and listen to the story. The torches had burned low in the corridors of the Domus Publica, casting long, restless shadows along the walls where senators once whispered their ambitions. The city of Rome, ancient and sprawling, now slept under a velvet sky, the moon, a pale and watchful eye, above the Tiber. But within the marble heart of Caesar's home, sleep refused to come. Julius stood by the open arch of his chamber, his white robe folded softly around his shoulders, though the night was not cold. Outside, a slow Roman breeze carried the scent of iron and laurel, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called once, then fell silent, as if thinking better of interrupting the heavy quiet. He had dreamt again. He hadn't told Calpurnia, not this time. She was restless enough with the omens that had danced through her mind. These past few nights, wolves howling beneath the Palatine, ghosts seen near the Forum, lightning striking the Capitoline gate. Rome, she whispered, was breathing strangely, and tonight even the stars had seemed dull, blurred behind thin clouds, like veils drawn before a sacred shrine. But the dream, that dream, was different. Not a vision, not a warning, but something deeper, a memory that had not happened yet, a future echo, a whisper from the silence that follows great endings. He could still feel it. In the dream, he had stood in the Senate house, alone. The marble beneath his feet had been cracked, and the great statues of ancestors and gods had turned their faces away. He had heard footsteps, many footsteps, though he saw no one. And then, blood rising between the tiles, warm, spreading, and a single olive branch dropped at his feet. When he had awakened, the room had been silent, too silent. Now, standing in the dark, he watched the moon pass slowly through the clouds. He did not move. His fingers rested on the cold stone of the balustrade, and his thoughts drifted. Julius Caesar, Gaius, dictator, consul, general, father to Rome, and yet tonight, only a man, tired, remembering. He thought of the old battlefield beneath the hills of Gaul, the mist rising like a breath from the earth as morning broke over blood-soaked fields. He remembered his soldiers' boys, most of them now lost to Timand, the way they sang after victory, drank like gods, then wept quietly when no one was looking. He had carried their names, each of them. Even now, in the private recesses of his mind, he kept them, not as trophies, but as ghosts. They marched with him still, quiet shadows in his retinue. He turned away from the window, the floor cool under his bare feet. His steps made no sound. The villa was asleep, save for a single servant who sat at the end of the corridor, half dozing with a lamp in his hand. Caesar walked past him like a specter, offering no word, no glance. The atrium was vast and dark, the pool at its center reflecting the shifting stars. He paused there, staring into the water. He had always believed in signs not as omens to be feared, but as patterns waiting to be read. Even as a boy in Subura, he had known how to listen to what others missed. Not the words of oracles, but the pauses between words, the glances, the hesitations, the silence before applause. He had made Rome listen to him in those silences. And now, silence pressed back. Behind him, Calpurnia stirred. She had risen without a sound, draped in linen, her hair loose, eyes still shadowed by dreams. "You're awake again," she said gently, not as a question. He nodded once, just restless. Her fingers reached for his arm. "Don't go tomorrow." He didn't answer. "The dreams," she continued, "they're not just dreams. Even the priests say the entrails were wrong. The birds flew backward. I feel something." "I know," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes catching the low lamplight. "Then why go?" He turned away, and for a moment, he wasn't Julius Caesar. He wasn't even Gaius. He was simply the last boy of the Iuli, standing in the dark, listening to the quiet death of certainty. "Because," he said slowly, "to stop now would be to tell Rome that I am afraid." She said nothing. She didn't need to. He leaned down, kissed her brow, and whispered, "Sleep, I'll return before noon." But even he knew that was a lie. He walked back toward the study, where scrolls lay scattered from earlier debates. Taxation in the East, the reconstruction of the Forum, letters from Egypt that smelled faintly of perfume and palm oil. He touched none of them. Instead, he stood before a statue of himself, carved only a year prior. Its marble face stared blankly ahead, young, powerful, immortal. He almost laughed. He sat. The dream came back. But this time, he didn't resist it. The room faded. The marble dissolved into mist. The torches winked out one by one. And suddenly, he was walking through the Forum again. Only this time, it was empty, not quiet, empty. The stones were cracked, the arches fallen. Ivy strangled the walls. Statues had no heads. The great temples stood like skeletons. He walked alone. In the distance, he heard music. Faint, discordant, not Roman. Something older, deeper, as if the earth itself were singing in grief. Then he saw them. Figures, dozens of them, senators in white togas, their backs turned. And among them, a boy no older than 10, barefoot, holding a crown of laurel thorns. The boy approached and held out the crown. Caesar reached for it, and the moment he touched it, the earth split. He fell into fire. He awoke, gasping. The room was still, the servant still asleep, Calpurnia still quiet in the inner chamber. He breathed, he stood, and he knew morning was not far. The Ides had come. But there was still time to walk, just once more, through the sleeping streets of Rome. Perhaps, he thought, if he kept walking, he would wake again. But something deep within whispered otherwise. The sky above Rome had begun its slow turn toward dawn, though the stars still lingered faintly in the deep blue, reluctant to yield to the sun. A soft mist clung to the stone streets like a forgotten shroud, pooling in alleys and curling around columns as though the city itself were breathing in uneasy sleep. Caesar stepped into that hush alone. He had left without ceremony, passing through the courtyard gates without waking the guard. His steps, deliberate and soundless. The streets were as he remembered them, worn by centuries, polished by the souls of slaves and senators, and echoing now only with the faint whisper of breeze and his own presence. The Tiber whispered below the embankments to his right. It moved like a slow serpent, black and gleaming under the stars, sliding past Rome as it always had, indifferent to names, titles, triumphs. Caesar walked without direction, not to the Curia, not yet. His heart was not heavy, only full, like a cup brimming not with fear, but with everything that had ever been unsaid. Thoughts, memories, the quiet kind that come only at the edges of endings. He passed beneath the arch of Septimius Severus. Its carvings were older than his triumphs, and yet still sharp. The bas-reliefs showed parades, legions, gods. Now, in the torchless dark, they seemed like ghosts marching eternally in silence. He paused there. A beggar stirred nearby, wrapped in a thin blanket against the chill. The man looked up, just once, his eyes hollow but not unkind. "Great Caesar," he murmured. "Is it morning already?" "Not yet," Caesar replied softly. The man nodded, smiled faintly, and closed his eyes again. Caesar moved on, past the empty stalls of the Forum's market, where the scent of old bread and spiced wine still lingered from the day before, past the Temple of Saturn, whose great columns loomed like sleeping sentinels, and where he once delivered speeches that reshaped the fate of provinces. He did not speak now. He only listened to the scrape of his sandals, the soft call of an owl in the distance, the heartbeat. He was not a god. Not now. He was simply a man on the last page of his life, rereading the lines before the ink ran out. He passed by a statue of Venus Genetrix, his divine ancestor, if legends were to be believed. Her face was calm, beautiful, eternally patient. For a moment, he stopped before her and let his hand rest on the base of the pedestal. "Will they remember me as your son?" he asked quietly, "or just as a tyrant?" No answer came, of course, but then movement. A young girl appeared at the edge of the alley, barefoot, dressed in a worn tunic, carrying a clay lamp no bigger than her palm. She looked at him without fear. "Are you lost, sir?" she asked. "No," he replied, after a pause. "Not tonight." She stared at him, eyes wide, then smiled as though she knew something he didn't. "The gods are awake," she said. "They're watching." Then she vanished back into the mist. Caesar lingered. A chill moved down his spine, though the air was still warm. The words clung to him like a distant echo. "The gods are awake." He resumed his walk, through alleys that bent like ancient arms, through courtyards where olive trees whispered and rainwater glistened in marble fountains. Every street he crossed had once been his by command, his by will. But now they merely welcomed him as a guest. In a small square near the Theater of Pompey, he stopped to sit on a stone bench. It had been years since he'd sat here last, perhaps before Gaul, before Rubicon, before everything had changed. He let his eyes close, and in that darkness, old sounds returned. The roar of the crowd in the amphitheater, the cries of wounded men at Elysia, the voice of his mother, Aurelia, stern and proud, the laughter of Servilia, the silence of Brutus. The name rose like smoke in his mind. He had not summoned it. It had come on its own. He had loved him once, like a son, or a mirror. He had wanted Brutus beside him, not behind, but power, ... Power made sharp lines between men. It could turn loyalty into fear, fear into silence, silence into betrayal. Still, some part of him, deeper than the skin, could not hate Brutus, not even now. A dog barked in the distance. The mist had begun to thin. The outlines of the city grew sharper, less dreamlike. Dawn was crawling up the hills beyond the eventing, a red blush at the edges of the sky. He rose. Time was drawing close. He turned toward the capital, walking slower now, his mind retreating inward. What had it all been for? The wars, the Senate, the crown he refused, then craved. He thought of the calendar that now bore his name, the reforms, the cities rebuilt, the libraries funded. And yet the people, what would they remember? Not the laws, not the roads. They would remember the end. He came to a narrow street flanked by the homes of patricians. One window was lit. A scribe, perhaps, or a woman nursing a child. Life still moved, unaware of what the day would bring. He paused at the steps of a small shrine, a forgotten god, its name worn off by wind and time. He placed a coin at its base. For the ferryman, he said. Then he smiled, a dry, tired smile, one that knew too much. He continued walking, past the old stones that once echoed the feet of tribunes and consuls, past the bronze doors of temples he once entered as a boy clutching his mother's hand. Rome, at this hour, was a ghost of itself, a hushed city of shadows and memory, wrapped in pale light and ancient breath. The sun had not yet risen, but the world was beginning to remember color. In the dimness, the red of his cloak deepened, the white of his tunic caught the last of the starlight, and his face no longer the carved marble of coinage, but the tired, thoughtful mask of a man held no fear, only stillness. He turned down the Via Sacra. A woman swept her doorstep with a bundle of old reeds, her back stooped, her hair silver. She looked up as he passed. Their eyes met. "Caesar," she said softly, not in greeting, but like a prayer. He nodded. She didn't ask where he was going. Perhaps she knew. Ahead, the capital loomed. He passed the steps of the Temple of Jupiter, his footsteps slower now. Every breath he took felt as though it were being counted, measured, like sand in an hourglass. He could almost hear it, the faint ticking of the world, shifting. Rome was preparing to wake, and he was preparing to end. He thought again of Brutus, of Cassius, of those long meetings, polite smiles, hiding knives behind teeth. Rome was not a city of love, was a city of balance. And when power tipped too far, it corrected itself violently. Caesar had become the imbalance. The one name spoken too often, the one face seen too clearly. He understood, not with bitterness, but with recognition. He had walked willingly into the myth, knowing what waited at the end of it. But before he reached the Senate, he turned down a side alley, narrower and darker, where no senators walked. Here, Rome was older. The stones were uneven, the air heavy with time. He passed an old bakery, its shutters drawn. The scent of ash and flour clung to the walls. A boy once stole bread from this place. He remembered chasing him down, not as Caesar, but as a man still chasing purpose. He had let the boy go. He wondered what became of him. A small dog barked, startled by his presence, then darted into the shadows. The world was beginning to stir. Birds chattered. The bells from the temple chimed softly in the distance. He looked toward the Forum once more. The Senate House stood clean and still beneath the sky, columns bathed in golden light. It was almost beautiful, and yet it felt so far away. He paused before a statue of Romulus and Remus, suckling at the wolf, the eternal symbol of Rome. "Is this what we were born for?" he whispered. The silence offered no answer. Then a voice behind him, "Eurily." Caesar turned. It was a man he did not recognize, hooded, cloaked, standing near the corner, where shadow met sunlight. His hands were folded, his face hidden. Caesar studied him. "Do I know you?" "No, but I've known you for a long time." The words came slowly, almost gently. "I've seen you at Pharsalus. I saw you cross the Rubicon. I saw you write your name across Gaul, in blood and law and legend." Caesar said nothing. "I've waited," the man said, "as all endings wait." Caesar took a step closer. "Are you death?" The man chuckled. "I am not that kind. No, I am only the reminder, the final page." Caesar looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. "I'm not afraid. I know." The man pointed toward the Senate steps. "They are waiting. Not just the men with daggers, but all of them. The ones who will write your name, curse it, praise it, whisper it in shadows for 1,000 years. Then let them," Caesar replied. The man bowed his head. "Go well, Imperator." Caesar turned away, and the man vanished without sound. The forum was awake now. Servants bustled, guards shifted. The street was lined with life again, wheels clattering, sandals striking stone, conversations rising like birds startled from trees. But Caesar walked through it, untouched, like a figure from another world. The morning sun lit his shoulders. The laurel crown lay heavy in his thoughts, though not on his brow. He approached the Senate. The Curia stood solemn, its great doors waiting, open like the mouth of fate. The senators within were already gathering faces, familiar and strange, robes, white eyes like flint. He could feel them, and still he did not slow. He climbed the steps, one by one, each one echoing in the marble like a drumbeat. He paused at the top, turned one last time, and looked out over Rome. The rooftops shimmered in morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys, a city waking, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to know. He closed his eyes. The dream returned. But this time, it was not fear that filled him. It was peace. He walked inside, and history held its breath. The hour was late, and yet the silence within Caesar's private chamber had grown heavier than any Roman battlefield. The oil lamps flickered against the frescoed walls, throwing dancing shadows of pine branches and marching soldiers across the ceiling. Outside, the city of Rome slept uneasily beneath the waning moon, unaware of the storm gathering within its marbled heart. Caesar stood at the open window, the fabric of his white tunic brushing against the chill of the March air. Below him, the forum lay in darkness, empty save for the occasional clatter of a guard's sandals or the cry of a distant owl. He could hear the Tiber whispering in the distance. That old river had watched Rome rise from muddy huts into temples of gold and marble, and now it would watch what he did not know. The dream had returned again that night, more vivid than ever. But this time, it wasn't a battlefield or a crown he saw. It was a garden. Olive trees stood in a semicircle. Their leaves whispered in a tongue he could not understand. In the center stood a woman cloaked in black, her face veiled, her hands raised to the stars. Caesar had tried to approach her, but every step he took made the trees grow taller and the woman more distant. He awoke with the taste of iron on his tongue and a voice echoing in his ears. "Beware the curve of time, for all roads end in the shade." The words clung to his chest like chainmail. He hadn't told anyone, not even Calpurnia, not even Mark Antony, certainly not Brutus, especially not Brutus. In the morning, he moved through the halls of the Curia with the grace of a man who had forgotten how to feel fear. His hands glided across scrolls and signatures. His voice carried the calm of a priest giving blessings to the sea. but his eyes, those old, war-worn eyes, searched every corner, every marble pillar, every breath of air. The Senate, he knew, was no longer what it had once been. Once, the Curia was filled with fire-blooded men who debated with passion, who lived and died for the res publica. Now it was filled with eyes that refused to meet his hands, that trembled too long on the hilts of ceremonial daggers, and voices that called him Father of Rome, with tongues made of honey and steel. Still, Caesar believed in fate. What else could explain how a boy from the Suburra, born into a declining patrician family, had become the most powerful man the world had ever seen? He believed the gods had chosen him for a reason. But tonight, as dusk painted the rooftops in hues of blood and bronze, even Caesar began to wonder whether the gods were whispering a different tale now. That evening, Brutus stood on the Palatine Hill, watching the torches below sway like dying stars. The wind moved through the pines like a forgotten hymn. His hands were cold despite the warmth of the Roman spring. In his tunic was hidden a lettering marked, unsigned, and yet unmistakably written in the language of guilt and ambition. He will make himself king. Will you kneel, Marcus Junius Brutus? Or will you remember who your father was? He had read it a dozen times, perhaps 100. He had once loved Caesar like a second father. But Rome was not a family, it was a flame. And those who held it too close burned their skin and their names forever. Behind him, Cassius approached, his sandals brushing softly against the stone. "The stars are favorable tonight," he said without looking up. Brutus didn't respond. Cassius narrowed his eyes. "You still hesitate," Brutus whispered. "It's not hesitation, it's mourning before the crime." Cassius chuckled darkly. "He is not a god, Brutus. He bleeds, just as you do." "But I still remember the day he gave me my first sword," Brutus said quietly. "I was only a boy." "And now," Cassius said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you will give him back what he gave, steel for steel. That is the way of Rome." The two men stood in silence, the moon climbing slowly behind the Forum. Far from the Palatine, Calpurnia watched her husband sleep. He had collapsed early, his body weary beyond measure. She had lit no lamps, for she feared the light might wake the dreams. Her fingers brushed his brow, searching for peace, but finding only tension beneath the skin. He murmured in his sleep, Latin words mixed with names she didn't recognize. Then a cry escaped his lips. Not loud, but sharp, like a blade pulled from its sheath. Calpurnia shivered, her heart whispered the words, her mouth dared not say, "Don't go tomorrow," but she knew he would. He always did. In the deepest hours of the night, beneath the marble sky of Rome, a storm was brewing, not of thunder or rain, but of steel and whispers, of ambition wrapped in togas, of gods long silent now stirring in their tombs. The Sibylline priestesses of the Aventine Hill lit candles in trembling rows. Birds flew in frantic circles above the city. A low rumble came from the earth, as if even the stones of Rome knew what was coming. And somewhere, in the temple of Jupiter, a statue cracked just slightly along its marble shoulder. No one heard it, but the gods did. At sunrise, a golden ray slipped across Caesar's face, warming his skin like the touch of a gentle hand. He opened his eyes and saw Calpurnia watching him. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, softly, "I dreamed again." She nodded. "It was different this time," he said, sitting up. "I wasn't afraid." She reached for his hand. "Then don't go today. Stay with me. Stay with Rome." He smiled sadly. My love, I am Rome. He dressed without haste, the white tunic, the red cloak, the laurel wreath, gleaming like sunlight on olive oil. As he stepped into the atrium, he paused, then turned back to Calpurnia. If the fates come for me, he said, tell them I lived as I was meant to, with my eyes open. Then he walked into history. The street to the Curia was filled with citizens, unaware of the play unfolding behind the marble walls. Some called his name, some offered him figs or laurel branches. Children ran beside his litter. One little girl cried out, "Hail Caesar!" and he smiled, tossing her a bronze coin engraved with his profile. At the steps of the Senate, the conspirators waited. Brutus clutched the dagger beneath his toga, as if it burned his flesh. Cassius whispered to him, "He suspects nothing. The gods are with us." Brutus felt only silence. Inside the chamber, the senators rose. Caesar entered like a man entering a sacred grove, calm, proud, ready. He had one more dream to fulfill. The Tiber River moved like silver ink under the night sky, its dark waters rippling in calm rhythm as the moonlight curved gently across the rooftops of Rome. A distant temple bell hummed low, and beyond the city's heart, all sounds began to dissolve like salt into warm air. And somewhere, not far from the silent porticos of the Palatine Hill, the dream of Caesar continued, not as a man awake in power, but as one slipping further into the deep currents of memory. He was no longer alone in the corridors of his mind. From the long marble hallway, veiled in mist and torches that never burned out, Caesar approached a door he had seen before in his dreams, a golden archway guarded by no soldier, flanked by no lion, and yet heavy with an invisible warning. Its silence made the heart stir and the soul hesitate. He stepped through. On the other side was not Rome. It was something older. A land where myths still breathed, where shadows spoke like philosophers, and the ground pulsed with the memory of empires forgotten. A forest stood here, not the wilds of Gaul, nor the pinewood glades of Germania, but something older, almost sacred. Trees that twisted like columns of an abandoned temple, branches that dripped with starlight instead of dew. The path was marked by oil lamps, each suspended mid-air without chains or flames. He heard his name spoken, not in Latin, but in tongues that predated language. Caesar, Imperator, Nameless One. The words wrapped around him like wind through a cloak, calling not the man who conquered Gaul, nor the man who crossed the Rubicon, but the version of him that had once been a boy on the streets of Subura, barefoot, thin, and watching the world with wild eyes. The forest opened into a vast amphitheater, carved entirely from bone-white marble, polished smooth and laid in rings. Statues stood between the seats, gigantic, faceless, and ancient. Their eyes were hollow, their heads turned toward a stage that shimmered with no performer. Caesar descended slowly, and as he reached the heart of the arena, the marble beneath him glowed faintly like an old fire remembered. And there she stood, Calpurnia, but not as he had last seen her, in tears and fear. Here she was dressed in white, her hair wrapped in golden thread, her eyes calm. She did not speak. Instead, she placed in his hand a scroll sealed with a black wax emblem he did not recognize. The seal bore a winged hourglass, cracked in half. Read it. Her voice finally broke through the stillness. He opened the scroll, but no letters formed on the parchment. Only symbols, spirals, suns, daggers, a crown made of leaves turning to ash. And then the parchment dissolved into sand that fell through his fingers. "What does it mean?" he asked. but she was already fading. So was the arena. And now he was falling downward, endlessly, until the dream reshaped. He awoke on a stone floor, but he had not left the dream. This was Rome, but older, darker. The bricks were damp, the air thick with incense. It smelled like fear and worship. The torches here flickered nervously, as if they, too, felt the weight of something watching. Before him stood an altar, and atop it, a masca, theatrical one, carved from obsidian, unmoving yet powerful. A voice came not from a man or woman, but from every wall. Every empire ends in silence. Yours began in noise. Do you remember? He did the Senate. The roaring of crowds, the clinking of coins bearing his face. The voice continued. But do you remember what was lost along the way? And now, from the shadows, emerged the forgotten. The faces of men betrayed. The wives cast aside. The allies turned rivals. Bibulus, Cato, Pompey, Brutus. Each one carried a candle. Each candle dimmed as they passed him. Brutus lingered last. His candle flickered most. You taught me to believe in the Republic, he whispered. And then you killed it. Caesar reached for him, but his hand passed through. Dreams do not lie, the voice said. But they do not flatter. The scenery changed once again. He now stood in the center of a temple, though massive, circular, open to the sky. It was the Pantheon, but unfinished, as if built not by men, but by the gods, in the middle of thought. The heavens whirled above him, and stars arranged themselves in patterns maps of time, rivers of fate. A child appeared, not Roman, barefoot, dressed in a cloth tunic, olive skin, dark eyes. He held out a small bowl of water. Caesar bent to take it. When he drank, he did not taste water, but memory. He tasted his first campaign, Spain, rain and blood. He tasted the betrayal of Crassus, the long silence of Cicero. He tasted the Rubicon, and then he tasted the Ides, that future always seen, never believed. He saw himself in the Curia, cloaked men around him, daggers, blood, the marble floor, drinking it like wine. Is that the end? He asked. No, said the child. It's the beginning of forgetting. Forgetting what? That you were ever just a man. Now, he walked the forum again, but it was buried in sand, like a forgotten city. Statues lay broken. Columns had crumbled. The temple of Saturn stood crooked. The arch of Titus was a ruin. But in the center, untouched, stood a single tree. From its branches hung scrolls and written histories. He reached for one. It burned in his hand. And then from behind the tree came a figure hooded tall, carrying a scale in one hand and a sword in the other. Your deeds have outlived you, the figure said, but so have your shadows. Then judge me, Caesar whispered. No, the figure said. You must judge yourself. And now the dream slowed. His breath matched the rhythm of waves he could no longer see. The sound of Rome faded to the hush of wind through leaves. And Caesar, once emperor, once mortal, stood alone in a space of nothing but time. It was here he understood. Legacy is not what survives after death. It is what dies in silence while we still live. A single feather drifted down before him, gold, glowing. It landed on the ground and vanished. He knelt not in surrender, but in stillness, not to the gods, but to the truth that dreams can only carry you so far. And so ended this phase of his dream. But another lay just ahead. The fire had dimmed low in the halls of Pompey's theater, and Rome slept, unaware of the fragile thread on which the future dangled. In the hours after midnight, while lamps flickered in forgotten chambers and dogs barked to the wind, A cold wind swept across the stone steps of the Temple of Apollo, where marble gods had witnessed too many broken promises. But Caesar was not asleep. He stood alone inside the portico of the temple, his figure cloaked in a dark woolen mantle, hood drawn to hide the telltale curve of his profile. He came not to pray, nor to be seen. He came because something inside him stirred within a dream that wouldn't let go, and an instinct older than any omen or augur. The marble statue of Apollo loomed before him, protector of truth. Caesar looked up into those lifeless eyes and felt the absurdity of it all. Even Apollo, once worshipped with trembling lips, now stood silently as Rome bled its own future dry. He reached out, barely brushing the stone pedestal with his fingers. "You too are silent," he murmured. His voice, soft and low, seemed to disappear in the vast hall. Outside, a servant watched nervously from the shadows. He had been ordered not to speak, not to be seen, but he saw Caesar pause, hesitate, and finally reach into the folds of his robe to draw out a scroll, unsealed, unread. It had been delivered to him earlier that evening. An anonymous letter slipped into his hand in the Senate corridor. He hadn't opened it, not yet. Now, before the god of prophecy, he finally did. "Beware the Ides of March." That was all it said. No name, no plea, just a whisper written in ink. Caesar stared at the parchment for a long time. Then, slowly, he folded it and tucked it into the sleeve of his robe. He left the temple without a word, his footsteps echoing through the marble as if chased by time itself. The Senate stirs. Elsewhere in the city, Gaius Trebonius stood in his chambers with a half-finished goblet of wine, debating whether he had already damned his soul. The plan had been agreed. The knives were chosen, the men committed, but the silence of Rome that night was too heavy, too vast. Cassius had said it would be quick. Brutus had insisted it was for the Republic. But Trebonius, once a loyal officer under Caesar, now felt the weight of betrayal like a stone around his neck. He poured the wine onto the floor. Tomorrow, there would be no turning back. A stranger's visit that same night in a hidden villa along the Tiber. Calpurnia dreamed. In her dream, the rivers turned red and the forum crumbled. Statues bled, and men in white togas wept openly as black birds circled above. She awoke, trembling, not with fear, but certainty. A slave approached quietly and offered a candle. "Shall I summon your husband?" "No," she said, after a long pause. "He will not listen." Then, unexpectedly, a knock, a quiet, rhythmic knock. Her guards froze. The hour was far too late for visitors. When the door opened, a veiled woman entered, no name given, no voice offered. She handed Calpurnia a folded cloth wrapped in silk, then disappeared into the night. Inside was a single sprig of asphodela flower the Greeks once believed grew only in the meadows of the underworld. The final morning, the sun rose pale and slow, veiled behind thick gray clouds. Caesar sat at the breakfast table, barely touching the dates and olives. His appetite had left him hours before. Calpurnia stood beside him, hesitant. "Julius," she said softly, "do not go to the Senate today." He looked up at her. "You've had another dream." "I have," she said, "and this time, it is not just fear. I saw blood on your hands. I saw the Capitol drown." He gave her a faint smile and reached for her hand. "I have stood against armies, storms, and omens for half my life. If I am to fall, let me fall in daylight, not hiding behind closed doors." "You mock prophecy." "No," he said. but I do not surrender to it." As he rose from the chair, he noticed something tucked beneath his plate. It was the same parchment from the temple, but this time, a single drop of wax sealed it shut again, though he had never resealed it. He opened it. The words had changed. "They gather in the chamber of Pompey. Steel will meet flesh. You must not enter." Caesar stood frozen. Calpurnia watched, breath held. But when he looked up, the mask had returned. "I will go," he said. And with that, he stepped into the corridor that would lead him to the Senate. The procession, the streets, were strangely silent. His litter bore him slowly through the heart of the city. Crowds that once cheered his name now watched in curious silence. Some averted their eyes, others whispered. Near the forum, an old man shouted, "Beware the Ides," and was immediately dragged away by soldiers. No one laughed. Trebonius met Caesar at the steps of Pompey's theater. "A full house today, Caesar," he said, voice strained. "Then let us not be late," Caesar replied. The doors creaked open. The chamber smelled of old stone, smoke, and something metallic. Senators rose as Caesar entered, the echo of sandals on marble sharp in the tense air. He greeted them as usual. He didn't see Cassius tighten the strap on his dagger, didn't notice the slight nod from Brutus across the room. But he noticed one thing. Marcus Cicero, usually the loudest voice in the room, was absent. Caesar narrowed his eyes. The curtain begins to fall as he stepped toward the central dais. A senator approached with a petition. Another stepped behind. Another moved to his left. "Caesar," said Brutus, "we must speak of liberty." He turned to face them. "Liberty?" he asked, and then he saw the knife. The rain was light that morning, a misty veil draping itself over the tiled rooftops of Rome, as though the heavens themselves whispered of a coming change. Inside the villa, time had slowed. The flickering oil lamp cast golden halos across the sleeping form of Calpurnia. Her hands folded over her chest, her breath shallow and peaceful. Julius stood near the threshold of her chamber, watching her with a gaze that was no longer merely political or imperial but personal, as if, at last, the conqueror had become human. He moved away from the doorway and entered his own quarters, where scrolls lay unfurled across his writing table, messages from the Senate, from the eastern provinces, from loyalists and enemies alike. But none of them held meaning now, not in the way they used to. The world had shifted slightly, and Julius could feel it in his bones. The dream had followed him again. It wasn't just one night, it had been coming for weeks now, perhaps even months. A strange corridor of light, and in the corridor were figures draped in ancient robes, whispering things he could not hear. They always stood just at the edge of clarity, and each time Caesar would step closer and awaken before he reached them. This morning, however, was different. He had awakened mid-sentence's own voice echoing into the dark. He had been speaking to someone in the dream, someone who resembled himself, but not quite. The figure bore a laurel wreath and wore a breastplate, but its face was aged, deeply lined, and its eyes were heavy with mourning. The man had looked upon Caesar and said one line, "You have crossed Rubicons that never existed." Julius had jolted upright, sweat along his brow, breath heavy. He had written the phrase down in his private notebook and stared at it for a long time. What did it mean? A metaphor? A warning? Or simply the mind cracking under years of triumph and loss? Outside, the city began to stir. At the forum, The marble began to glow pink in the first blush of dawn, and market stalls opened under awnings, slick with dew. Servants unrolled their woven rugs, vendors laid out their fruits, and the common Roman people moved like gentle waves between the pillars of empire. It was a city that did not know it stood at the edge of an age. Meanwhile, in a shaded corner of the city, a man named Publius Ceruleus Casca sat beneath a grapevine trellis, fingering the handle of a blade hidden under his tunic. His palms were damp. He wasn't yet a killer, but he would be, not for glory, not even for Rome, but because silence had become unbearable. He had seen Caesar refuse the crown, not once, but thrice, and each time it made the senators murmur louder in their cloaks. They called it humility, but Casca saw ambition thinly veiled. He wasn't alone. Brutus had grown quiet again, his mind a storm under the calm of philosophical speech. Cassius spoke of shadows and daggers, now as if they were scripture. Even Decimus had started walking, with his eyes on the ground, calculating the dream of Rome, they believed, was dying in slow motion, and they would be the ones to wake it. Far from the city's heart, in the foothills beyond the Tiber, an augur performed a morning reading. Birds, scattered from the bloodied entrails, laid across the altar. The priest frowned. Something was wrong. He read the organs again, tracing the liver's edge with a bone pin. No passage, no direction, he whispered. And blood where there should be none. He ordered silence. The wind did not stir. The gods were not at ease. Back at the villa, Caesar began dictating letters half-heartedly. His scribe, a thin man with oil-black hair, waited dutifully, dipping his stylus in ink, scratching out words on wax tablets that would be copied later onto papyrus. But Caesar stopped mid-sentence. He looked up, out the window. There, for the briefest moment, he thought he saw a figure in a white cloak, standing on the far side of the garden, motionless, watching. He blinked. The figure was gone. He rose, walked to the balcony, and looked again. Just bushes, just the trimmed laurel and olive trees. But something lingered. He returned to the desk. "Strike that line," he said quietly. "Begin again." In the Senate House, things were not as usual. A minor repair had halted meetings in the Curia, and Caesar had been advised to attend elsewhere, possibly the theater of Pompey. The irony was not lost on him. To meet beneath the name of his slain rival was a twist of history's dagger. Still, he agreed. His calendar was full. The Ides of March were just days away. That evening, Caesar and Brutus shared wine. It was not uncommon, though it had grown rare. Brutus, calm and deliberate, spoke of astronomy, of comets seen in the night sky. Caesar listened more than he spoke. "Have you ever thought," Brutus asked suddenly, "that our lives are not our own? That we merely walk the parts others expect us to play?" Caesar looked into his cup. "I have thought," he said slowly, "that destiny is a stage upon which the strongest survive, but perhaps the gods are the audience, not the playwrights." Brutus smiled sadly. "And what role do you think they cast for you?" Caesar didn't answer. The night passed quietly, but two men who once shared the same future now dreamed different dreams. Across the city, in a modest home with ivy-covered walls, a woman sat writing in a journal. Her name was Portia, wife of Brutus. She wrote not of politics, nor death, nor empire. She wrote of stillness, of olive trees swaying in quiet winds, of her husband's distant eyes, of fear she could not name. And beneath her words, the candle flickered violently. Dawn would soon rise again. And in that narrow space between dream and daylight, Julius Caesar stood once more in the hallway of his vision. The robed figures turned this time. One lifted an arm. The corridor began to crumble at the edges, folding inward like burning parchment. Then a voice came not from them, but from behind him. He turned. It was the child again, the one he had seen in earlier dreams. The boy with sharp Roman features, barefoot, glowing faintly as if backlit by dawn. "Do you know what you are?" the child asked. Caesar hesitated. "A name," he finally said. The boy nodded. "And names die, too." He reached out his hand. "Come." Caesar stepped forward and awoke to thunder. The dream had turned darker. In the candlelit corridors of memory, Caesar now found himself back in the hushed Senate chambers. Not as the man standing tall, but as the shadows whispered around him. Stone columns loomed like sentinels, and marble busts watched silently from alcoves. The room was empty of people, yet full of voices, voices from his past, echoing with caution, anger, prophecy. Et brute. His whisper was a ripple in the silence, but no one answered. He stepped forward, sandals brushing against the ancient tiles, and suddenly the floor below him gave way, not collapsing, but transforming until he was walking across a massive scroll, a parchment of Roman laws and decrees. Every step forward revealed more inked memories, victories, betrayals, letters to the Senate, decrees for the people, whispers to lovers, warnings to generals. This was not history written by others. This was his history, bleeding from his own pen, but also soaked in the ink of others. He was never the sole author of his life, and in this dream, he finally realized that the next turn brought him into the Forum Romanum, bathed in a strange twilight. All the statues of Rome's heroes, Romulus, Scipio, Cincinnatus, had their eyes closed. Their mouths were sealed with vines. The glory of the Republic had become silent, blind, and voiceless. Then, from behind a broken column, stepped a boy, no more than 12, dressed in the tattered tunic of a street urchin. But his eyes were as old as the Senate itself. "You're Caesar," the boy said plainly. Caesar nodded. "The dream too deep to pretend otherwise. And do you regret it?" The question hung heavier than any crown. Caesar looked around at the buildings bearing his name, the archways he'd walked under in triumph, the silent statues. "I did what Rome needed," he replied. The boy tilted his head. "But did Rome want what you gave?" Caesar opened his mouth, but found no answer. The dream did not wait. It turned again, reshaping the world around him like a potter's hands. He was now in the house of Brutus, long before the Ides. Brutus stood before a mirror, polishing a blade, not with malice, but with trembling fingers. The dream let Caesar observe, unseen. He saw his friend's anguish, the hesitation, the prayer to Mars, the tears that fell onto the steel. This was not betrayal born in ambition. It was heartbreak. The blade that would pierce Caesar had been sharpened, not in hate, but in a torn duty, the belief that Rome must be preserved at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing the man who had done so much for her. Caesar stepped closer in the dream, reaching for the trembling Brutus, but the vision crumbled, shattering like glass underfoot. Now he was standing at the foot of the Rubicon again. He could still feel the weight of that moment, the horse beneath him, the cold bite of the night air, the men waiting in silence for his command. The die is cast. His voice echoed once more across the waters he had crossed. There was no turning back. And now, in this dream, he turned and saw what he had not seen that night, the ghostly forms of all those who had fallen because of that step. Pompey stood furthest in the mist, his one-sprowed armor tarnished, his eyes full of questions that Caesar still could not answer. Did he do it for power, or because he believed Rome could not survive another generation of Senate chaos? Even in the dream, the answer was unclear. Next, he was a young man, again just a boy, back in Subura, where the streets smelled of wine, oil, and wet stone. His mother Aurelia sat at the door, weaving, her eyes occasionally rising to check the alley. He saw himself chasing pigeons, calling to a friend named Marcus, who would later vanish in the wars. That child had no thoughts of power, only curiosity. The dream allowed him to sit beside Aurelia just once more. She did not see him, for she was of memory, not presence. But he whispered to her, "Did you know, mother? Did you know what I would become?" And in the strange alchemy of the dream, she looked up, and for a moment she saw him. "Yes," she said, and the world glowed gold, but gold quickly turned to ashes. Now the streets of Rome were burning. Not in reality, not like the fires of Nero's future, but symbolically, spiritually. The dream showed what could come. Statues of senators cracked, temples collapsed. The Colosseum, not yet built, stood in ruins before it even existed. This was the Rome of fear, the Rome that would follow empire. No republic, no balance, just emperors and blood. "Did I begin this?" Caesar asked aloud. A wind carried no answer, only the laughter of distant children, and the slow rise of a throne made of swords. From the flames emerged a woman. She wore a violet cloak and held a scroll sealed with wax. "You've seen much," she said, voice calm, "but not everything." Caesar approached, unsure if she was Sibyl, fate, memory, or something older. She unrolled the scroll, a map of the empire, stretching far beyond what he had conquered. "There will be others," she said. "Some who will take your name, others who will take your dreams. Few will understand you. Most will use you." The map began to bleed at its edges, turning into rivers and borders and battlefields. "Then why build it?" Caesar asked. "Why begin what cannot be controlled?" She met his eyes, because dreamers do not build for safety. They build because they must. The dream turned again. Now, he was on the steps of the Curia, the Senate house, just moments before his death. The sky was a strange crimson. The stones beneath his feet were damp. He walked through the doors slowly. Inside, every senator he had ever known stood in a circle. No daggers, no anger. They simply looked at him. "You returned," said Cicero, breaking the silence. "I never left," said Caesar. A beat passed. Then Cicero asked, "Then what did you learn?" And Caesar, with the weight of all his dreams, mistakes, and glory upon him, said, "That power is only sacred if held for others." The circle of senators nodded, and with that, the dream grew softer, the chamber blurred, and Julius Caesar, the man of ambition, love, war, and words, began to walk upward into a white light that pulsed like a heartbeat, gentle and vast. The last dream did not end with a crown. It ended with peace. The night deepened over Rome, but the glow from the Palatine Hill had not dimmed. Fires still crackled in distant braziers. The villa where Caesar slept was silent, save for the occasional shift of the guards outside. Yet within his dreams, the roar of a different fire kindled, one not made of wood or flame, but of memory, fate, and the unseen. He wandered again in that marble hall of shadows, the same place. Yet tonight, something had changed. The statues wept, not tears of water, but red, slow streaks from stone eyes. The Senate, once looming in proud confidence, was crumbling inward as if the very idea of the Republic had grown tired and was folding into itself. But Caesar's footsteps remained soundless as he walked. In the distance, a whisper called his name, not loudly, not urgently, just consistently, as though the wind itself had memorized the syllables of his fate. He turned, and from the dark emerged an older version of himself. Same laurel, same toga, but the eyes were tired, as if they had seen centuries ahead. This apparition smiled, but it was not a smile of warmth. It was resignation. "Have you ever wondered what the world does with men like us, Julius?" the specter asked. Caesar stood speechless. "It forgets us, then revives us, then rewrites us." The dream flickered like a torch about to die. When Caesar awoke, sweat cooled against his brow. The morning was hours away, yet he no longer desired sleep. Later that day, the augurs came. They brought entrails from sacrificed animals, red with sacred eyes. The omens, they said, were strange, unclear, but not favorable. Calpurnia, too, had dreamed. Her sleep was broken by the sight of his statue bleeding, nobles washing their hands in it, and laughter echoing from empty chambers. "My lord," she pleaded, "do not go to the Senate today. Stay, just for today." Caesar smiled at her concern, kissed her forehead gently. "The Senate waits, and the Republic cannot." But within, his chest was tight, not from fear, but from the weight of converging signs, dreams, and histories not yet written. As he rode through Rome that morning, the streets were quieter than usual. A fog had rolled in from the Tiber, soft, pale, and ghost-like. People walked slower. Even the birds seemed to perch rather than sing. A young soothsayer caught sight of Caesar near the theater of Pompey. "Beware the Ides of March," the voice rang. Caesar turned, amused. "It is the Ides, the youth said. But the day is not done." He laughed, brushing it off like a leaf on his shoulder. Yet the words stuck to him, like the dream, like the old man who shared his face. Within the theater of Pompey, the senators had gathered. Some idly discussed legislation, others whispered, and some had hands twitching toward hidden blades. Brutus sat apart, head low, fingers pressed together. Guilt had etched new lines in his face, but resolve hardened them. He believed this act was not treachery, it was salvation, or so he told himself. Cassius, ever watchful, eyed the room like a general. He saw nerves, he saw anticipation, and he knew they were close. Back in his chamber, Caesar sat one final time before his statue. He looked up at its stone eyes. They held no answers. "I have crossed the Rubicon," he whispered. "I have tamed Gaul, chased Pompey to the sands of Egypt, reformed Rome's calendar, and now I fear I have become more than Rome can tolerate." A knock, a messenger. The Senate awaited. His walk to the Senate floor was quiet. Every footstep was a heartbeat, every glance a judgment. As he entered the chamber, a sudden hush fell over the room. Even the torches flickered with unease. Metellus approached. A small matter, a petition, a distraction. Then Tullius Cimber grabbed his shoulders, not with warmth, but with force. Caesar stood, confused. Why this violence? Steel flashed. Cerilius Casca struck the first blow, clumsy, grazing his neck. Caesar turned, eyes wide. "Casca, what is this?" More daggers, more hands, more betrayal. Brutus came last, and when their eyes met, Caesar's voice, soft, not angry, et2, brute, then silence. The chamber echoed only with breathing, dripping footsteps backing away. And Caesar, wrapped in his white toga, fell at the base of Pompey's statue, blood painting the stone he once sought to replace. But this was not the end. For Caesar's death birthed something stranger. That night, the sky above Rome turned copper red. Dogs howled. The Tiber overflowed. Cicero wrote letters in shock. Mark Antony wept. And in the streets, whispers grew. Not whispers of sorrow, but vengeance. The dream had ended, but its echo had only just begun. Far away, in Alexandria, a woman stood on a balcony, overlooking the harbor, her black hair caught by the Mediterranean breeze. Cleopatra had not heard yet, but she would. And when she did, a plan would be set in motion, a legacy unfolding. The dream deepened. Rome was silent, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of anticipation, of breath held tight, like a city listening for the first crack of thunder across an endless sky. Somewhere between sleep and memory, Caesar wandered through an unfamiliar Rome, where time was fragile and the faces of old allies blurred like the edges of fading marble. He walked alone through the Senate portico, except it was not the portico. It was something older, darker, half ruins, half palace. The floor beneath his sandals felt like shifting sand, and the air was heavy with the weight of unsaid words. From behind a crumbling column stepped the faint outline of Cicero, but his eyes no longer sparkled with cunning, nor his tongue curled with eloquence. He stared at Caesar with the long silence of a man who had seen too much, said too much, and died too early. "You wanted peace, Gaius," Cicero finally said, his voice echoing like wind in a tomb. "But Rome was never made for peace." Caesar tilted his head, unsure if it was accusation or absolution. "I wanted order," he replied, "and you brought storms." They stood facing each other, not adversaries, not friends, but to echoes of a republic that had crumbled, not from fire, but from the wear of ambition. Suddenly, the scene changed. The forum melted into an open field beneath a blood-orange sky. There, a young Roman soldier was kneeling, a standard broken beside him, his eyes toward the dying sun. Caesar recognized the insignia, the eagle of the lost 9th Legion. "Do you remember them?" a voice behind him asked. It was Calpurnia, his wife, not as he had last seen her, in panic and tears, but composed, regal, and distant. "I sent them north," Caesar murmured, "to silence the tribes. They never returned." "No," she said, "because they followed your shadow, not your orders." He tried to speak, but the wind stole the breath from his lips. Night fell again in the dream, and Caesar found himself in the heart of a massive labyrinth. Its walls were covered in frescoes, painted scenes of his victories, his decrees, his betrayals. Each step echoed with a name: Brutus, Cassius, Antony. He reached the center of the maze, where a single olive tree stood, surrounded by lions, sleeping like statues. At its base sat a boy in a simple toga, scribbling something into wax with a stylus. "Who are you?" Caesar asked. The boy looked up. "I'm the Rome you never saw, the one you never ruled. I'm the part that grew after you, and do I exist in your stories?" The boy nodded. "You do, but not as a god." A long pause. "Then how?" The boy smiled gently. "As a warning." The dream dissolved again. Now Caesar stood in front of the Rubicon, its waters no longer clear, but thick with the ink of countless scrolls. The river bubbled with every decision he'd made, every law twisted, every oath broken. He looked down at his hands and saw them stained, not with blood, but with writing. Laws, decrees, speeches, all clinging to his skin like leeches. "You crossed this river once," said the voice of Pompey, materializing beside him, still in his full general's armor. "I did what I had to," Caesar replied. "No," Pompey said, "you did what you could." He turned and walked into the river, his figure dissolving into letters and parchment as he sank. The dream sharpened. Caesar now sat on a balcony overlooking an impossible version of Rome, a city built from layers of centuries, where chariots rolled beside steam machines and senators shared streets with monks and soldiers from unknown futures. It was the Rome of every era, built on the ruins of itself. Behind him, a door creaked open. Octavian entered, not the boy Caesar had adopted, but the man he would become, Augustus, the first emperor. "Is this what you wanted?" Augustus asked, gesturing to the city below. "I wanted Rome to last forever," Caesar said. "And at what cost?" Caesar sighed. "At the cost of myself." Augustus nodded, then turned away. "You gave Rome your name. I gave it an empire." The vision faded. Caesar now stood alone in the theater of Pompey, but not on the Ides of March. No, this was different. The hall was full, but no one moved. Statues and shadows sat side by side, frozen in applause or disdain. At the center, his own body lay on the floor, wrapped in a golden shroud, still bleeding from wounds long remembered. And at the top of the hall, on the highest bench, sat Death. She was not cruel. She did not grin or sneer. She simply watched, as if waiting. Caesar approached slowly. "Was it all for nothing?" he asked her. She tilted her head. "You were a man of dreams, but Rome never sleeps." And with that, she raised one hand, and the hall disappeared into mist. Caesar woke, or perhaps he didn't. Now he stood in the field of Mars, where all generals are buried in memory, if not in body. The sky was neither night nor day, and the air carried the scent of laurel and ash. In the distance, a torch flickered, then another and another. Shadows approached, not to harm, but to walk with him. Crassus, Scipio, Constantine, Trajan, even Nero. Each held part of Rome in their palms: fire, scrolls, swords, coins, and Caesar held nothing. "You were first," said Constantine, "but not last." "Your dream woke us," said Scipio. "But your legacy lies asleep," said Nero with a smile. Caesar nodded. He stepped forward into the firelight, and Rome, the eternal dream, swallowed him whole. Caesar stood still at the threshold of the temple of Janus, where past and future were said to meet in silence. He could not tell whether this moment belonged to the world of men or to the dream of gods. The torches flickered not with flame, but with starlight itself, casting reflections of battles never fought and roads never taken on the cold marble. Inside, the two-faced god Janus awaited. One face looked backward, the old man with a beard of time. The other, a youth with bright, unblinking eyes, stared forward into futures not yet born. Caesar, now aware he was walking not in the waking world, but through the memory of fate, felt something deeper than fear. He felt the weight of inevitability, like water carving the shape of a stone. Janus spoke without speaking. The air shimmered with meaning, not words. "Julius, you walk within your final hour, stretched across eternity. Shall we review what brought you to this dream?" And so, the temple floor beneath Caesar's feet turned translucent, and he saw again the Rubicon, that thin line of defiance. He saw his sandals step across it, watched the Senate tremble, and heard the thunder of his own legions behind him. That moment, the crossing echoed through every chamber of his dream. Even now, his dream self felt the river's chill touch, the final gasp of a republic as it slipped beneath imperial tides. He had crossed not just water, but Rubicon itself, a line of no return, not only for himself but for the entire Roman world. From the left side of the temple rose shadows of people he had once loved: Cornelia, his first wife; Julia, his beloved daughter; Pompey, once his son-in-law, then his rival; and finally his ghost. Each stood behind a veil of memory, fading in and out with the dream's rhythm. Caesar wanted to speak, but in this dream space, it was feeling, not sound, that mattered. He recalled them with such clarity that their presence returned, if only for a moment, and each left him not with a farewell, but with a question: was it worth it? The youthful face of Janus opened its mouth now, and this time, it was not memory but future that poured out like breath. What will become of you when the Ides of March carve your name into stone and whisper it to eternity? Suddenly, Caesar was standing not in the temple, but in the theater of Pompey. The seats were empty except for statues carved of those he'd betrayed and those who would betray him. The marble Caesar looked up from his pedestal, blade already in his back, and asked silently, "Is this the price of legacy?" The ceiling cracked open like an egg, and stars spilled into the theater. But these were not stars from the sky, no, they were faces. The countless people whose lives he had altered: soldiers and slaves, senators and street merchants, lovers and liars. He saw their fates like threads unraveling from a tapestry he never meant to weave. Now the dream shifted again, and Caesar was a boy. He stood in Subura, the poor, tightly packed Roman district where he had grown up. His mother Aurelia braided his hair, and the smells of bread and dust and sweat filled the morning. A street performer juggled near the cistern, and two legionnaires bickered over dice. Everything was so real, he forgot this was a dream, until he saw the child himself run past. But the boy didn't look at him. He ran toward the Capitol, a wooden sword in his hand, shouting for Rome. That boy had no idea what Rome would demand from him. The adult Caesar followed him through alleyways that twisted more like memory than geography. Every turn led to another moment from his youth: his father's funeral, his escape from Sulla's death list, his seizure on the road to Bithynia. And all the while, Rome towered above like a sleeping beast, its breath a lullaby of conquest. He realized then that Rome itself had always been his true rival, not Pompey, not Brutus, not the Gauls. It was the city, the idea, the unquenchable desire to outlast death by ruling time itself. And even Rome could not promise that. The dream deepened. Now, Caesar stood aboard a ship, not crossing the sea, but sailing through time. The waves were made of whispers, Cicero's biting words, Cleopatra's smooth counsel, Cassius's trembling prayers. As the ship creaked forward, each wave took him to a different future, a possible one. In one, he saw himself as king, robes of purple, a crown upon his head. But Rome burned in the background, devoured by the hatred that title would summon. In another, he stepped down, surrendering power to the Senate, but he died in obscurity, forgotten. A third vision showed him dying just as he had on the Senate floor, but history remembering him as a god of civilization, the pillar upon which an empire would stand for centuries. He whispered into the dream sea. Which fate is true? The sea answered, all of them, and none. The ship struck something. It wasn't a reef. It was a mountain, rising from the sea, colossal statue, carved not of stone, but of consequence, the face his own, but aged 1,000 years. The statue crumbled before his eyes, falling into the sea. And where it fell, grass grew, cities rose, languages changed, crowns came and went. Genghis Khan, Charlemagne, Napoleon, even modern men in suits, all borrowed his name. Caesar watched as time used his memory like a tool, like a myth, like a mirror. He realized then the future did not remember. Hemet reshaped him, and still he slept. He returned now to the temple. Janus was gone, not for betrayal, but for love, for the man he had admired so much that he could not let him become a tyrant. The dagger slipped from Brutus's hand. The reflection changed again. It was Caesar older than he had ever been allowed to become. Walking through the countryside with no armor, no crown, just a cloak and staff. Children followed him. He taught them stories. He planted olive trees, and then the mirror shattered. Caesar awoke. He was back in his bed just before the Ides. The sky beyond the curtains glowed faintly, the first blush of dawn. He heard a bird chirp and the rustle of leaves beyond the forum. For one breathless moment, he wondered if he should cancel the Senate meeting, stay home, write letters, walk by the Tiber. But the dream's weight settled over his shoulders like a purple mantle. He rose, clothed himself, and stepped into history. The forest had thinned, and in its place rose a vast open plain bathed in silver-blue moonlight. Julius Caesar, cloaked in dreamlight and memory, stepped cautiously across the soft, dew-covered grass. In the distance, a river shimmered like polished obsidian, winding silently through the heart of the dream. The air smelled of lavender and ash, sweetness and sorrow braided into one. A murmur ran along the wind, not quite words, but fragments, names, whispers, echoes of men who had stood beside him, and those who had knelt beneath his ambition. He paused. The dream had brought him here for a reason. Across the water stood a small wooden bridge, old Roman work, humble yet enduring, and beside it, a figure. Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar said before the dream could even shape the name. Brutus turned. His face was neither angry nor ashamed, only weary. The face of a man who had not slept in centuries. "You walk this far to see ghosts?" Brutus asked. "No," Caesar said softly. "I walk because I never truly stopped walking, even in death." Brutus looked down at the flowing water. "This is the river of remorse. Few cross it willingly." Caesar stepped forward. "Am I meant to beg forgiveness or grant it?" Brutus didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured to the bridge. "What you find on the other side isn't justice, it's only truth." The wood beneath Caesar's feet creaked, but held strong. The river whispered below like an old woman murmuring prayers. Each step across was accompanied by a vision, brief flashes of history that blinked behind his eyes. He saw Vercingetorix kneel before him, his long blonde hair soaked in the mud of Gaul. He saw Cleopatra, her gaze shimmering with fire and calculation, wrapped in linen and prophecy. He saw Roman senators in shadowed corridors, their togas heavy with fear. And he saw himself laughing, bleeding, crowned and crowned again. The other side was a pale hill rising like a memory from the mists. At the top was a stone chair, worn and cracked, surrounded by the statues of those Caesar had once admired. Cato the Younger, Scipio, Africanus, Sulla, Cicero. None spoke, they only watched. He sat. "Julius," said a voice behind him, soft, feminine. "Have you come to justify your life?" He turned Calpurnia. She looked younger than she had in life, her hair dark and full, eyes shining with the sadness of knowing too much too soon. "I had dreams," she whispered, "but you didn't listen." "I feared weakness more than I feared the gods," Caesar replied. "And yet it was pride that killed you." Her hands were cool as she reached for his face. "You were a man of the stars, Julius, but you forgot the ground beneath you." He lowered his eyes. "I wanted Rome to be eternal." "And it was," she said gently. "Just not in the way you imagined." The dream shifted again. Now he stood before a battlefield that never truly existed, where time stood still and every warrior was a memory. Across from him stood Pompey, eyes like sharpened iron. "We were friends once," Caesar said. "We were competitors," Pompey replied, "and then we were enemies." The two circled each other, not with swords, but with words. The ground between them littered with treaties, broken pacts, and letters never sent. "Was it worth it?" Pompey asked. Caesar looked toward the hills where Rome's future flickered, a city of emperors, of fire and glory, of collapse and resurrection. "No," Caesar said. "And yet, ... yes." A child approached him, now barefoot, wrapped in rags, eyes wide as moons. "Are you the man they speak of in stories?" the boy asked. "I was," Caesar said. "And you?" "I am Rome," the boy replied. Caesar knelt, then listened carefully. "One day they'll try to crown you again, again and again, across ages. But you must never forget, the laurel is not your destiny. It is your burden." The boy nodded, then vanished in smoke and sunlight. Caesar now found himself in a quiet villa, dreamscape modeled after his youth. He sat on the steps with an older man, his father, whom he had barely known. "I made your name eternal," Caesar said. "You made yourself eternal," his father replied. "But your soul still seeks peace. How do I find it?" The older man stood, touching his shoulder. "When you stop reaching, when you let the echoes fade." He wandered now through an empty Senate chamber, where stone chairs held nothing but dust. Each seat called his name, but none offered him comfort. Suddenly, from behind the speaker's podium, came a sound: footsteps. Cassius, lean, cold-eyed, still bitter. "You loved the Republic," Cassius sneered. "But only after you took its bones and carved them into a throne." "I loved Rome," Caesar said, unmoved. "You loved power," Cassius corrected. Caesar gestured around them. "And you stabbed to save a ghost." Cassius smiled grimly. "And in return, I became one." Hours passed in dream time, or centuries. He saw his adoptive son, Octavian now, Augustus, standing in full regalia, offering him a crown made of stars. But Caesar turned away. "You wear it better." He met Cleopatra again, but she no longer flirted with ambition. She offered him an urn filled with Nile water and said, "Drink and forget your wars." He drank, and the water tasted of olive trees and ruined marble. He now sat alone on a bench overlooking a ruined garden. Flowers bloomed and withered with each breath. And then he heard it as soft music, lutes, lyres, faint voices singing. He stood. The dream had one more step, one final gate, one last vision. The gates opened, revealing a Rome not of the past, but of memory, alive with laughter, children playing, markets bustling, a city without emperors, without wars, just people. Caesar stepped forward and wept, not for what he had done, but for what could have been. A voice above him whispered, "The last dream ends not in glory, but in silence." And the world faded. First the marble, then the stars, then the man. The room grew colder, not because of the open window, but because of the silence that clung to the walls like dew. The silence that followed betrayal. Calpurnia stood by the fading light of a bronze oil lamp, the scent of burning olive oil mixing with damp stone and rose petals. The palace had grown quieter since the Senate's decree to honor Caesar posthumously with a grand festival. Even now, Rome did not mourn. It watched, it whispered, it plotted. Yet, in the shadows of the Senate, something darker stirred. The whispers of ghosts. Brutus, no longer the face of stoic nobility, walked with something far heavier than guilt. A new rumor began to circulate through the alleys and insulae of Rome, that Caesar's soul had not found rest. It began with the Vestal Virgins. One reported seeing a man in white blood on his laurels, standing beside the eternal flame and whispering, "It is not finished." Then a street oracle saw a figure atop the Capitoline hill at dusk, robed in crimson, looking east. "Julius," she whispered, "looks to Egypt. His dream is not yet complete." And in Alexandria, Cleopatra began to prepare for war. The library of Alexandria held secrets no Roman had touched. Cleopatra had retrieved them all. She believed the dream had not died in the Senate. It had only migrated into the Nile, into silence, into her womb. Her child, Caesarion, had begun to speak dreams. At only 6 years old, he awoke in the middle of the night and said, "Father was not killed. He is only sleeping beneath the stones." The court priests trembled. In Rome, Octavian Caesar's heir stepped forward from the shadows. Young, sickly, but unnervingly calm, he began to move through Caesar's old networks, reviving alliances, visiting the army, speaking in hushed tones to Cicero, and offering clemency to those who feared revenge. But at night, Octavian dreamed. From it, a red bird flew out, circled once, and vanished into the sky. He awoke with a fever, whispering, "The eagle is rising." Meanwhile, the senators grew restless. Cassius began to carry a dagger at all times, even within his robes. He didn't trust shadows anymore, not because of the plebs or Cleopatra, but because he kept hearing Caesar's voice, sometimes soft, sometimes laughing from empty rooms. And one evening, Brutus vanished for 3 days. When he returned, his hair had turned nearly white. He would not speak of where he had been. Only this: "I saw the Tiber bleed." The city changed. At midnight, the fountains ran red not with blood, but with rust. The sky turned violet before storms. Birds flew west and never returned. In the temple of Jupiter, a statue of Caesar cracked across the chest. Then, without warning, a scroll arrived from Egypt, addressed to the sons of the Senate. It bore a golden seal in the shape of an asp. The message read only, "The dream breathes. The Nile is rising. You buried a man. We awaken an empire." Octavian read the message in silence. Then he looked across the hills of Rome and whispered, "Then let the old world end." He began gathering ships. Days became weeks. A wind stirred across the Mediterranean, and in every port town, from Brundisium to Athens, sailors spoke of strange sightings, ghost ships bearing no flags, sails the color of dusk, and statues of lions at their bows. They said they came from Egypt, but they made no sound. Some swore Caesar himself stood on one deck, arms outstretched, robes shining like the moon. None dared approach. Cleopatra prepared the great hall of Alexandria for what she called the dream ritual. It had not been performed since the days of the pharaohs. It was soaked in oil and firelight, and on its surface Caesarion placed his hands and whispered, "Let him rise." In Rome, a tremor cracked the forum. The Senate convened in haste. Cicero's voice trembled as he recited omens. One augur claimed to have seen Romulus and Remus fighting in the stars. Another declared that Mars himself had left the heavens. Then, without knocking, Octavian entered the chamber. He said only, "You have 1 season left. Then I return as Caesar." He dropped the scroll from Egypt on the floor. By autumn, the harbors of Italy were filled with sails. Not all bore Rome's eagle. Others still the mark of Caesar's personal sigil. A lion devouring a serpent. The armies did not yet move, but they watched. And across the sea, Cleopatra whispered to Caesarion, "Your father dreamed of eternity. Now we must build it." But deep beneath the stones of the Curiaware, Caesar had bled a crack widened in the earth. No builder, no priest could explain it. From it came a sound faint, steady, like breathing. The last dream had not yet ended. The forum was still. The marble columns stood like frozen trees, casting long, twisted shadows under the moonlight. Not even the wind dared whisper between the sacred stones. And yet, Caesar felt a presence, a pull, a stirring, as if the ground itself remembered him. His sandals made no sound as he walked across the empty plaza. Where once the shouts of senators and merchants rang out, now only silence greeted him. He paused beneath the old arch of Severus, the stone carved with victories he had once mocked for their simplicity. Now, the reliefs looked worn, weathered, like the memory of a world that had forgotten its own emperors. Then a flicker, a figure, robed in white, appeared at the edge of the square. Not walking, floating. Caesar tensed. Brutus. The figure said nothing, only raised a pale hand, gesturing silently toward the temple of Saturn. Caesar's eyes narrowed. That was the treasury, the heart of Rome's wealth, the foundation of its empire. And in his final years, the very building whose corruption he had sought to expose, he followed. Each step he took brought with it memories, not just of gold and betrayal, but of whispered arguments in secret corners, of senators clutching their togas in fear of what Julius might uncover. Inside the temple, the air was colder, and then he saw them, all of them, a semicircle of silent, ghostly forms. Senators, generals, scribes, men he had dined with, men who had plotted his death, men who had cheered for him and turned their blades on him the next morning. "Do you come to haunt me?" Caesar asked softly, his voice echoing in the sacred hall. "No," a voice replied, not from one, but from all. "We come to finish the dream." The dream, that word rang out like thunder in his chest. For all his ambition, for all his triumphs, it had always been about that. The dream of Rome, a republic reforged in strength, a people united under vision, not greed. He had tried, gods knew he had tried. "You failed us," said one of the phantoms. Stepping forward, it was Cicero, unmistakable, even in death. "And yet you also saved us from ourselves," the others murmured. "You killed the republic," said another voice, Cato. "Perhaps, but it was dying already," whispered yet another, soft like the wind through olive branches. Caesar stood in the middle of them all. "Tell me then, was it worth it?" No one answered. And then slowly, the scene changed again, not through motion, but through memory. He was back in Gaul. The battlefield stretched out beneath gray skies. Fires crackled in the distance. Horses screamed. He walked past tents stained with mud and blood. He saw his younger self, strong, unshaken, sword at his side, a general untouched by time. You had a choice, the ghost of himself said. You could have stayed here, ruled from afar, let Rome fall, and built your own kingdom. I know, Caesar replied, but I loved it too much. A smile, not cruel, just sad, and it never loved you back. That truth, heavy as stone, not Cleopatra, not the Senate, not even the people he had fed and clothed and entertained. In the end, Rome had not loved him. It had needed him, used him, and discarded him. But he didn't regret it, because even now, centuries later, his name still echoed through time. Another shift. He was in the Curia of Pompey again, the Ides of March. But this time, he was not dying, he was watching. From the shadows, he heard the muttered prayers, the nervous breath of those about to strike. He watched Brutus step forward, his hand trembling, his mouth forming a silent apology. And then the blade fell again and again and again. And Caesar, as an unseen ghost, whispered to the scene, I forgive you. The moment froze, the blood hung in the air, suspended like rubies, and in that suspended world, the true dream returned, not of empire, not of war, but of peace, of fields without fire, of roads without soldiers, of a Rome that didn't conquer but built, a Rome that didn't exploit but led. He had glimpsed it once, in the eyes of a child born in a Roman camp, in the smile of a farmer who could read because the libraries had been preserved. That was his dream. It had always been. He was back on the Palatine Hill now, alone. The forum below glowed under moonlight, empty and eternal. And for the first time in centuries, Caesar sat. Just sat. No throne, no crown, just a man, tired from dreams. The night deepened. The stars wheeled overhead like a senate of gods. And in the quiet of the ancient city, a whisper rose from the stones. History remembers the sword, but it sleeps beside the dream. The light that bled across Rome in the early morning did not shine. It crept, pale, reluctant, as if it too mourned the weight of history soon to unfold. The marble statues that lined the forum, once bathed in proud sunlight, now stood ghost-like in the mist. Their eyes stared into nothing, carved centuries before, never blinking, never knowing they would witness the fall of one of Rome's most relentless minds. A soft wind passed through the basilicas, ruffling cloaks and scrolls, as the Senate prepared to meet. Julius Caesar did not sleep the night before. He sat at his writing table, surrounded by half-read petitions, unopened letters from governors in far provinces, and the fading glow of 3 oil lamps. A servant had dozed off by the doorway. The house had grown quiet hours ago. Even Calpurnia's sobs had ceased. She lay in bed, motionless, gripped by fear. Her dream, her nightmare of her husband's murder, in the very place he now prepared to walk into, still haunted the walls. But Caesar was calm, not content, not proud, but calm. There was something unnervingly still about him that morning, as if his soul had already accepted the script written in the stars. He stood from his desk, just as the first crow called out into the city. The bird's cry echoed off stone and silence. Time, he whispered. He donned a simple white toga with a faint crimson trimaronic, Calpurnia would later think. Crimson like spilled blood, like prophecy wrapped in fabric. The laurel wreath that had once been a symbol of triumph now felt like a noose. Still, he placed it on his head. His steps through the atrium were slow, purposeful. Outside, a few guards waited with their horses. Mark Antony had sent word he would escort Caesar to the Senate personally. But the message had not arrived, or worse, had been intercepted. As Caesar emerged from his home, the light caught his face. He paused and looked upward. The heavens were streaked with a strange, unnatural red. He smiled faintly. Even the gods mark the day. The journey to the theater of Pompey, where the Senate had relocated during repairs, was quiet. No applause, no chanting citizens, just the shuffle of hooves and the rustle of togas in the wind. Beside him, a trusted aide spoke hesitantly. "My lord, perhaps we delay today's session. There are rumors." Caesar looked at him not with anger, but with a sadness that pierced deeper than any rebuke. "If I begin fearing shadows," he replied, "then Rome will know Caesar has already died." The entrance to the theater loomed like a tomb carved into history. Senators milled about, pretending normalcy, cloaks drawn, hands clasped, eyes wary. As Caesar entered, a hush spread, not from respect, from tension, a weight, thick, suffocating. He walked past men he had known for decades. Cassius, Brutus, Casca, all smiled, all clutched hidden blades. They allowed him to ascend the steps of the Curia, allowed him to approach the golden chair reserved for Rome's dictator. Then, like wolves breaking their circle, they moved. The first hand gripped his shoulder. Caesar turned, puzzled. The second blow struck his back. The third pierced his side. He stumbled, confused, betrayed. Why? He did not cry out. He did not plead. Blood now soaked the marble. Then Brutus stepped forward. The boy he had raised as a son, et tu, Brute. The question was not accusation. It was heartbreak. He no longer resisted. He pulled his toga over his face and crumbled at the base of Pompey's statue dead before he struck the floor. Rome did not erupt into chaos, not at first. The conspirators flooded the streets, crying liberty, and tyranny is dead. But no crowds cheered, no women wept in joy. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of the Rubicon, voice of reform, and breaker of aristocracies, now lay a lifeless heap beneath the gaze of Pompey. The city held its breath. Mark Antony was too late. He arrived as the senators scattered like frightened birds. The scent of oil and blood still lingered in the chamber. He did not scream. He knelt, touched the edge of Caesar's robe, and whispered, "The gods weep with Rome." He would not forgive. He would not forget. Within hours, he rallied the loyalists. Caesar's will was read aloud in the forum. The people learned that he had left them land, grain, and forgiveness. He had asked for no revenge, no empire, only peace, and now he was gone. Rome burned days later, not in fire, but in fury. Civil war erupted. The Republic bled. Octavian Caesar's young adopted son merged from the shadows. Barely a man, but already sharper than any dagger. He would become Augustus. The empire would rise. Caesar would be declared a god. But in his final moment, he was only a man, a tired, betrayed, mortal, man asking one question: even you? In the years that followed, stories of Caesar's final night became legend. It was said that a slave saw a ghostly figure near his chamber, pale man in a toga, bleeding from the chest, whispering in Latin, "History is not kind to heroes." Others claimed Calpurnia's dream was the last true prophecy of Roman heated, unspoken, tragic. Still others believed Caesar knew all along, that his calm was not ignorance, but understanding. A final performance in a city addicted to drama. And so, as you drift to sleep tonight, remember, great men do not always die in glory. Sometimes they die in silence. Sometimes surrounded by friends holding daggers. and yet their dreams outlive them. The world still speaks his name, Julius Caesar. We hope you enjoyed the story. Stay with us and subscribe to Story Vault. There are many more tales to tell, many more shadows to walk through. Dim the lights, close your eyes, and we'll meet you again somewhere between dream and memory.